Morning everyone, and welcome to today's Infrastructure Victoria webinar. My name is Peter Katsademus. I am the Director, Networks and Plannings, and I'm delighted you could join us here today to discuss the findings of our report, Social Infrastructure in Melbourne's Growth Suburbs. Before we begin official proceedings, I would like to acknowledge our webinar is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples, and wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners of the land across the country. I would like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. To start, I would like to introduce you to the project team, Jodie Snedden, who's our Principal Infrastructure Advisor, specialising in infrastructure planning. Jodie has worked in local government, consulting, growth area planning, and both in state and in state government. Giselle Osborne is our planner, has strong GIS and data analytics experience, which is applied to this work, and experience working in local government. Also joining us today is our Communications Director, Mandy Frostig, who will be facilitating the Q&A at the end of the session. To give you a brief introduction, earlier this year, Infrastructure Victoria released a report investigating access gaps into social infrastructure across Victoria. This followed IV's recommendation to increase funding to support local governments to plan and deliver libraries and aquatic centres in Melbourne's growth area municipalities. That is detailed in our 30-year strategy. Giselle and Jodie both undertook the work to develop the recommendations, and you can find out more about the recommendations on our website. Today, Jodie will step you through the presentation on the findings of a report, and then later on we'll open up the webinar for questions where she'll be joined by Giselle. Please, throughout the session, enter your questions in the discussion panel on the right-hand side of the screen. Please remember to include your name and your organisation if appropriate. We may not be able to answer all your questions, but we'll try to get to them as much as possible. And when there's a bit of overlap with the two similar questions, we'll try to just combine them into one. But before we begin, please make sure you've muted your microphone. Please feel free to have a discussion about today's webinar on our Twitter handle, which is @InfraVic, and on LinkedIn. So, please continue. This is going to be an interesting discussion. Great to share that on socials. Also, please be aware that this webinar has been recorded, and we'll also make it available in the next few days. And we'll also, at the end of this session, send you all a survey. So please give us your honest thoughts and feedback on this so we can learn for future events. Just onto the next slide. Just a quick overview of Infrastructure Victoria and our role in the Victorian context. Basically, IV prepare a 30-year infrastructure strategy every 3 to 5 years. We were formed initially in 2015 and released our first strategy in 2016. That's a big part of what we do, and obviously we released the recent one just a few months ago. We also advise government on specific infrastructure matters. So if there's particular issues that come up that government want to get some independent advice on, they come to IV and we do our own research and advise government directly. But that's not all we do. We also, in between strategies, publish our own research. We identify areas that we think are required. So we do our own research, and we're continuing to produce a whole range of research to inform government on infrastructure and policy issues that we think should be adopted. But importantly, we are an independent body. Independence is embedded in the legislation that created us. So we're continuing to develop these recommendations that fear or favour, and we're engaging openly with the community and a range of stakeholders to develop these recommendations. So without any further ado, I will now hand you over to Jodie, who will take you through today's presentation. Oh, sorry, I forgot the next slide. Sorry, a bit of a time frame. So we developed as I said earlier, the inaugural infrastructure strategy in 2016. And in that time, we did a whole range of other research, which then informed our draft infrastructure strategy, which was released in December last year. And following that, we did a whole range of consultation with the community and a range of stakeholders. In fact, we had about 200 submissions to our draft strategy and about 2,600 independent pieces of information that was fed through to us. Most of that was done sort of early this year. And during that process, in fact, we didn't actually have the recommendation, which is recommendation 73 on libraries and aquatic centres in our draft. We became aware of the issue, and that's an example of where we've listened to the community and stakeholders and included that recommendation in our final strategy, which was released in August this year. So now I will hand you over to Jodie on the right slide. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. We're really glad to be able to have the opportunity to be with you today to share our background evidence base and thinking behind this recommendation for the state government to better support local government to deliver this critical infrastructure in Melbourne's growth areas. Specifically, the recommendation is in the next 5 years, increase funding to support local governments to plan and deliver libraries and aquatic centres in Melbourne's 7 growth areas. We believe that now is the time for a step change. The state government needs to better support local governments in these fast-growing suburbs. And without more substantial government support, the many hundreds of thousands of people living in these suburbs and who'll soon live in them will not have access to the critical social infrastructure that people living in Melbourne's established areas take for granted. Business as usual, as in these facilities, are local government responsibility to plan and deliver. It just isn't working for these growth areas. And today we're going to outline why we particularly selected libraries and aquatic centres, why we've shone the light on the growth area need in particular, and why we're suggesting that the state government role in both supporting integrated planning and additional funding needs to change. Next slide, please. So why aquatic centres and libraries? Well, they provide value for dollar. They deliver a high return on investment. They're multi-purpose. They can be designed as integrated facilities or hubs to meet a range of community need. They deliver high social, health, economic benefits, and they're inclusive places for all ages, all abilities, all cultures, and they're affordable. They're usually open 7 days a week and for long hours, and they're highly valued by communities. Research has shown that there's a $3.70 social return on every dollar investment in new metropolitan aquatic centres and a $4.30 return in economic and social benefits in every dollar invested in libraries. And we've put together a selection of case studies here to show you the types of services that can be programmed into these facilities. Next slide, please. We'll start with Realm in Ringwood Library. It's a beautiful library located as an integral part of the Ringwood Metropolitan Activity Centre. It contributes to the centre's public realm and it's easily accessible to the train station. Provides business services, co-working spaces, youth spaces, art spaces, council customer service desk, and it contributes to Ringwood Activity Centre's sense of place. Next slide, please. And then Melton. Melton's also located, Melton Library is located in the town centre and it's meeting the needs of its diverse and young community. It provides meeting spaces, children's programs, homework clubs, maternal and child health. Newly arrived residents can find support for English conversation classes, support for citizenship tests. There's a dedicated recording studio for hire, a 90-seat auditorium, computer training rooms, etc. Next slide, please. When we look at aquatic centres, we can look to the Wyndham Aquapulse Aquatic Centre in Hoppers Crossing. It has a major focus for young families as well. There's children's pools and water play and lap pools, occasional childcare, 3-year-old kinder program, and the full range of health and wellbeing programs like Pilates and yoga, etc. This centre is one of Victoria's most highly utilised centres, attracting up to 1 million visitors a year. That's about 2,500 visitors a day. Next slide, please. And if we look at the newly developed Rosebud Aquatic Centre, Yawa, in Mornington, it's meeting needs of an older demographic and families as well. It has health and consulting rooms, therapy for older adults and sports recovery, and services delivered by Peninsula Health. These types of facilities generate trips and economic activity in the precincts where they're located. Growth area councils are working hard to facilitate local economic activity and local jobs in growth areas. These facilities contribute to that. We considered other regional scale infrastructure as well, such as performing arts spaces and indoor sports courts. However, we also know that the state government is delivering 70 to 80 new schools in our growth area suburbs, all with competition-sized indoor stadiums. So there's enormous potential here to use these facilities outside school hours for these types of uses. We also recognise that sports courts can be integrated with aquatic centres, and a range of arts and cultural offerings can be integrated with libraries. Next slide, please. So why the growth areas? Well, there's three main challenges. First of all, it's not just the rate of growth, but it's the absolute numbers of people moving in across multiple growth fronts. The City of Wyndham suggests that they are managing service and infrastructure needs across 17 different growth fronts. By 2036, the equivalent of 10 cities the size of Bendigo will be added to these existing growth areas. We highlight in the paper the example of the City of Whittlesea, of the suburbs of Mernda and Doreen, a suburb now 20 years old and of almost 50,000 people, and they're still waiting for aquatic centres and libraries. So that's a generation of families who've missed out. We should be striving for better outcomes for our growth area communities. Our second challenge is just the cost. These facilities are expensive. New aquatic centres cost more than $50 million. New libraries are more than $30 million. But as you can see from the case studies, they're not just places to swim or borrow books. There's so much more than that. And the third challenge is there's limited funding opportunities. Existing development contribution mechanisms cannot fund regional scale facilities. They're designed to fund local and basic needs of new communities like meeting rooms and children's services. The growth area infrastructure charge funds state infrastructure. And yes, there are a range of grant programs, but they usually fund shovel-ready projects. They contribute only a small proportion of the funds to the cost of the capital cost, and they're often lapsing funds. These schemes do not provide the time required for planning or long-term certainty that councils need to undertake shared service planning to deliver multi-purpose integrated facilities. Also, metropolitan areas do not typically access federal government sports and community infrastructure grants, whereas regional Victoria does. With proper planning and funding certainty, this will open up opportunities for councils to deliver partnerships with other levels of government and even leverage other funds. State government could play a more substantial role in both the funding for these facilities, but also in the planning. And when we say planning, we're talking about planning in partnership with local government, not just across council boundaries or within growth corridors, but with other levels of government as well. For example, we could find opportunities to include children's services or primary health care and to be included in aquatic centres or libraries. Or we could find opportunities for adult learning, training, business support, digital access and inclusion, or arts and cultural offerings that could be integrated with libraries. So depending on local community need, potentially moving towards more state, not-for-profit and local government funded services co-locating in integrated hubs servicing our growth areas. In growth areas, these facilities can become even more important than they are in established areas. We've got a great opportunity here to plan and design for integrated hubs up front. We have the models such as Realm in Ringwood or Aquapulse in Wyndham. We can future-proof and provide flexibility in these hubs now so they can be programmed to meet growing and changing needs over time. That's why our recommendations included funding for both the planning and a higher contribution towards the capital cost. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the growth story. When we look at the 10 fastest growing metropolitan local government areas here for 2021 to 2036, and the green bars are the metropolitan growth areas. The growth area local governments are projected to be home to more than 930,000 people by 2036, which will represent over 40% of the state's projected growth. This chart here is just showing us growth through to 2036. This areas will even be larger by 2050. These growth area municipalities have additional challenges of not just providing for growth, but they're also looking at their older infrastructure that's under pressure, and many of these council areas include some of the state's most disadvantaged suburbs as well. Go to the next slide, please. We had a look at the fastest growing regional areas as well. And while some parts of regional Victoria are definitely growing, the scale of growth does not compare to these 7 local government areas. Casey and Wyndham, for example, are both larger than the City of Geelong. Hume, Melton and Whittlesea are each larger than the cities of Ballarat and Bendigo. And while we're all monitoring the impact of COVID on migration and population growth changes, we're also seeing working from home can help more people live in regional Victoria. The trends for growth in Melbourne's growth area is unlikely to change. In fact, it could even accelerate. We've done modelling on the effects of working from home, which suggests Melbourne's growth areas could even become more attractive places to live than they are now. Next slide, please. So our research focused on 3 pieces of evidence to demonstrate growth area need. We looked at the comparative rate of provision of facilities across local government areas. We did a cohort analysis looking at the provision rate for young people. And we looked at comparative levels of current and future accessibility. The limitation with our research is that we have not done the assessment about quality, condition, or capacity of existing facilities. This needs to be done at a local level. But if we look at now at the library provision rate, this chart shows from 2021 to 2036. The growth area councils are the light green, the inner Melbourne is the dark blue, and the other established areas of Melbourne are purple. In 2021, the average provision rate across Melbourne is the dotted line, which is 1 library for every 41,000 people. The black dot shows the current provision. The growth area councils provide fewer per capita for comparison. If you look at the extreme left, you can see the City of Melton has 1 library for every 90,000 people. And at the extreme right-hand side, you'll see the City of Kingston has 1 library for about every 20,000 people. I'll just talk about the Shire of Mitchell here for the moment because it has its own unique problems, and you'll see that when we look at the accessibility map. Mitchell's growth area sits within the metropolitan urban growth boundary and is part of the Northern Growth Corridor. But Mitchell also comprises rural townships like Broadford, Kilmore and Seymour. And whilst it appears that the Shire is performing quite well on this chart, the existing facilities are disconnected from where the Shire's metropolitan growth will occur. So we're providing a cautionary note that Mitchell's infrastructure needs need to be carefully planned and monitored. Go to the next slide, please. So the difference has become even more stark if we look at the provision rate for young people. If we look at the City of Casey, there's 1 library for every 22,000 young people, compared with the City of Yarra, where there's 1 library for every 3,000 young people. And if we move on to the next slide, please. When we look at aquatic centres, the trends are similar. The slide shows that 2021 provision rate, you can see that Wyndham at the extreme left has the lowest provision of 1 aquatic centre for every 140,000 people. And if you compare that to the City of Yarra, that's 1 to every 30,000. The diagram shows that at 2021, the average provision across metropolitan Melbourne is 1 aquatic centre for every 65,000 people. And if no more facilities are built, it'll be 1 for every 85,000 by 2036. If we go on to the next slide, please. And again, the trend starts to show up highly again for the young people who are going to be living in Wyndham, Casey, Melton and Whittlesea. one aquatic centre for every 48,000 0 to 19-year-olds in Wyndham, whereas one to every 5,000 in the City of Melbourne. And for young people, these facilities are critical infrastructure because they're inclusive public spaces for them, for young people to meet up, socialise, access learning, digital support, exercise and participate in sport. We often hear there isn't enough things for young people to do in these growth areas. And if these facilities are located along the principal public transport network, then many more young people could access them independently and through active travel without having to rely on parents to drive them in cars. Next slide, please. Okay, so we had a quick look at the level of provision in fast-growing regional areas of well. And on the left, you can see the library provision, and Wodonga here appears to have the lowest provision rate of about one library for every 40,000. And aquatic centres, the lowest rate is Geelong, with one aquatic centre for around 50,000 people. And these rates of provision are better than all the metropolitan growth areas as well. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is where we had a look at accessibility, current and likely future levels of accessibility. You can see the growth corridors on the edge, and the green areas are the completed and approved precinct structure plans in those corridors, and the red are the yet to be approved. 1.6 kilometre and 3.2 kilometre catchments were generated for each aquatic centre and library using our GIS software. The 20-minute neighbourhood principle uses an 800-metre walk as a benchmark for determining neighbourhood accessibility, a distance that corresponds to a 10-minute walk to a chosen destination. However, aquatic centres and libraries do not service neighbourhood catchments, but more typically a district or regional population catchments. This informed our choice to use larger catchment areas of 1.6 and 3.2 kilometres rather than 800 metres. It also demonstrates that at this level of accessibility, there are a few accessibility gaps across some of the established areas of Metro Melbourne, but no gaps as severe as what there will be in the case once the PSPs are fully built out. In inner and middle ring suburbs in particular, there are overlapping catchments, which suggests that the residents living in these areas have a number of facilities that they can easily choose from. And while it's going to take a while for these PSPs to be built out, we also know that it takes around 5 years from commencement to completion to deliver these types of facilities. So if we don't get started soon, we'll end up with many more situations like Doreen and Mernda. This is why it's so important that state government supports council to get on with this planning now, and that the state government should have a more supportive role in both planning across local government areas or within growth corridor level, or assist with the joining up with other areas of government to support the delivery of integrated hubs that can provide a range of services, potentially local, state government and other not-for-profit services in these facilities. Next slide, please. So drawing on our findings, and more specifically, we've recommended that planning should commence now for all 7 growth areas, and that all LGAs, including Casey, Cardinia, Hume, Melton, Wyndham, Whittlesea, will all look like they're going to require a new library in the next 5 years. And for aquatic centres, planning should commence now for all 7. And the Casey, Melton, Wyndham, Whittlesea all look like they're going to need an aquatic centre in the next 5 years. And again, we need to be monitoring where the growth sequencing occurs and where it arrives, and the timing and its level of connection to Mitchell's existing facilities. The next slide, please. So the cost, what we did, we cost all of our recommendations that we provide in our 30-year strategy. For this recommendation, what we've suggested is that each local government area is provided with $200,000 for aquatic centre planning and $100,000 for library planning. And we've recommended that to better fund these facilities, we should be funding up to a third of the cost, capped at a third of the cost, capped at 20 million, sorry, a third of a cost capped at 20 million for aquatic centres and 10 million for libraries in each growth area. The total cost of this recommendation, So if every library, every growth area had a new library and aquatic centre and planning, would be around $200 to $300 million. That includes some funding to support departmental staff, establish the fund and support local government planning, and integrate in with some state government planning as well. And whilst this cost might sound high, as we've highlighted in the social and economic return, for every dollar investment, the return is about fourfold. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jodie. Now, where to from here? So obviously we've delivered on our infrastructure strategy for the next 30 years in August this year. Following that, there's the background paper, which gives you more details about the work that Jodie's just spelt out. So feel free to go on our website and have a look at them. But now government has 12 months to respond to our strategy. So we sit and wait in some respects, but obviously we're still getting along doing our other research as well. And after they respond to our strategy, government will also give us their 5-year infrastructure plan. And then annually, in our annual report, roughly in October, we give an update on how government is progressing with that 5-year infrastructure plan. So that's basically where we're at the moment. More broadly, if you wanted to have more information, next slide, please. Yep. If you want to continue the conversation, have any inquiries, please email us on the inquiries@infrastructurevictoria.com.au. Equally, as I said earlier, please feel free to go on our social media pages, whether it be on Facebook or Twitter, and continue the conversation. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions already in the chat somewhere, so I'll now hand you over to Mandy, and Giselle will join us as well, and we can hopefully answer all of your questions.
Thanks, Peter. So the first question, I think, is for Jodie. Jodie, could you please just take us again over the benefits that you ascribe to both libraries and aquatic centres, those social benefits, and how that calculation is reached?
Yeah, so thanks, Mandy. So we relied on work done by PwC. Got the name, PwC. They calculated the $3.70 return on social investment for every dollar invested in metropolitan aquatic centres. I can't remember the figure now, but I think the return on investment on regional ones is a little bit lower. And the return on investment for libraries was undertaken by SGS, and they identified a $4.30 return in economic and social benefits in every dollar invested in libraries. There's quite a bit of detail in those background reports that are referred to in our paper if people wanted to look more deeply at how they were calculated.
Okay, great. And the next question, Jodie, could you please comment on the assumption in the presentation that the growth areas will be in Melbourne rather than growth will be directed to existing or new regional towns? So I think it's perhaps worth elaborating on the population assumptions that we've got. You might want Giselle to add some information to that, and how that's how we arrived at those figures. Additionally, as to whether or not we're expecting greater growth in those new regional towns.
What if I start, Giselle, and if there's something you can add on the modelling work we've been doing, or Peter?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, we touched on that. So we are seeing some additional growth going to regional Victoria, but the point we make here is that the scale and quantum of that growth is never going to be the same as we're expecting in Melbourne. We haven't seen a slowdown of the growth in the growth areas. We've seen it pick up, and our modelling shows that it's probably even going to be more attractive over time. So yes, we do need to keep an eye on our regional Victoria changes in growth, but the quantum is never going to be anything near what we're expecting growth areas. Giselle or Peter, can you add anything to that?
That's right. For this particular study, though, the figures that we looked at were so Victoria in Future 2019, which doesn't account for some of the changes in migration due to COVID. So that perhaps is one limitation of the study, but the modelling work that we have done certainly indicates that, as Jodie said, rather than becoming less attractive places to live, working from home is probably going to mean that there are more people living in Victoria's or Melbourne's growth areas in particular. Although, yes, as Jodie said, we do think that that regional story, particularly the regional Greenfield story, also does need to be monitored over time.
Yeah, and we've also got a report being released in a couple of weeks' time, which is going to shine a greater light on this, on the medium and long-term impacts of working from home. So that will also shine a light on where people are likely to move in the next sort of few years because of that.
Okay, thank you. Can I just remind people, if you have a question, you can type it into the chat, then we can feed it into this question and answer session. So the next question, it's a bit of a quirky one, Jodie. Is libraries the right name for these facilities anymore? They seem much more than libraries.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're libraries because we sort of know what they are, but they can be whatever what our communities need them to be. I mean, they can be digital hubs, they can be arts and culture spaces, they can be places to borrow books. I mean, I think that's the beauty of a library. It's changed over time, and not that long ago we thought libraries were going to come to an end because people were turning online and digital books, and wow, they actually reinvigorated themselves, and they've become even more relevant than they were then, particularly around the digital inclusion and how incredibly important they are, particularly for people who don't have access to good digital access. But they've also transformed as places for arts and culture and connection. They're probably my favourite piece of social infrastructure because they can do so much. So good on those librarians for not letting them demise with the transition to digital. In fact, they've put them on steroids. So call them whatever you like. They can be whatever you need them to be.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a lot of support for that response. One comment here, social infrastructure rather than soft infrastructure, and I don't recall you using the term soft infrastructure, but did you want to make any comments on that phrase, Jodie? I think I've heard you express some opinions on that before.
Yeah, like I don't think it's hard and fast how you classify them. Soft infrastructure, to me, makes it sound like it's not as important to the road, whereas I think they're more just as important in terms of livability, health, social, economic benefits. So yeah, it's not one of the terms we use, but I know others prefer that.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. They're coming in thick and fast now. So the next question is from Joyce Lawrence. Why are the local governments in the growth areas struggling to do what established local governments are doing? And this is more of a statement, we should be addressing the root causes of the problem as well as injecting funds. Did you want to comment on that, Jodie? Is it more than funding that causes this problem?
Well, we did outline 3 challenges. I think one of the main challenges is that in established areas, sometimes there's already government-owned sites or old infrastructure that can be turned around, or there might be activity centres where arrangements can be made, and that's the case with the Ringwood Metropolitan Activity Centre, where the council undertook quite complex land swaps to move existing facilities into that centre to leverage what they could with QIC, who were developing Eastland at the time. And I think for the growth areas where their activity centres are still quite undeveloped, those opportunities for partnership and leveraging are really quite limited. And again, the opportunity for old existing established areas have land that can be repurposed and buildings over time, and the Greenfields don't have that. So they're literally turning paddocks into infrastructure. So, and I think the point that Wyndham make is the 17 different growth fronts. So whilst a council like Maroondah might be looking at its new library for Ringwood Activity Centre and has a clear destination, when you look at the opportunity, there are challenges for places like Wyndham where growth is happening across multiple activity centres and 17 growth fronts. It's hard for them to prioritise exactly where they'll invest their funds. So I do think the Greenfield infrastructure issue is quite different to the established areas. I don't know whether Peter or Giselle want to add to that.
And the only other thing that I'd say as well is that, yeah, just the population growth that somewhere like Wyndham is experiencing is so, or Casey, is so great. I mean, as you said, there's going to be almost 500,000 people in both those local government areas, and they have established areas as well that they have to provide for. And overwhelmingly, they have young populations as well. So it's something like 40% of Melbourne's children will be in those local government areas. And for those particular cohorts, the need for particularly aquatic centres and libraries in those early years is quite great.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question, public galleries also play a vital role in supporting communities, education programs, school holiday programs, dementia programs, etc. Are galleries considered in the social infrastructure planning for outer metropolitan Melbourne? And I think your presentation covered off this towards the end, Jodie, if I'm right.
Yeah, I think again, galleries can be included in things like libraries, and we didn't get down obviously to understand the local service need, and I think that's the point. By if the state government, if arms of government like Creative Victoria could be linked with local governments as they do their planning, who knows what solutions we might come up with if galleries are needed, or other sorts of performing arts or arts activation. If we just join that up a bit better, as I said, these hubs could be really meeting multiple needs and multiple services. So I think that will all come from the art of the partnerships, I think.
Okay, and this is a little bit of a common theme that we addressed earlier, but one of the questions is relates to where growth is happening. So the question is, why can't the state government redirect growth away from suburban areas rather than encouraging it? The pressures on the environment caused by huge population increases are immense. So Jodie, did you want to advance an opinion on this aspect? Or Peter?
I think it's a very complex space. I think what we could point to as a simplified response is the government is aspired in Plan Melbourne to achieve 70% of its new growth in established areas and only 30% in Greenfield, and that's not being achieved. I'm sure there's some VPA people in the crowd now. I think it's more like 35% is going into, might even be more now, into growth areas. Giselle, you might know this, but it's not happening. The growth is going in at a faster rate than we thought into the Greenfield growth areas. And there's many reasons for that. And it's a complex policy space. And if, I suppose at a simple level, if we look at government's previous efforts to actively decentralise population, they've never been able to achieve it. The levers are weak for state government to achieve that. So I just don't think it's realistically an alternative urban growth form for Victoria. I don't know, does Giselle or Peter want to comment on that?
It's also about housing choices as well. There's affordability. There's a whole range of issues associated with it. And as Jody said, it's not a simple problem. But we've got all these activity centres that are that are scattered across the city as well. Over 130 activity centres. So it's about all parts working together. But you can't say to someone you have to go live in a particular location in Frankston or in or in Sunshine. People are making choices, and for whatever reason, or for a range of reasons, people are choosing to buy in these greenfield areas, and to socially engineer that they can't, then creates other problems as well. But there has to be, I guess, the rebalance can occur by creating more opportunities for people to have choices, so that when they're choosing, they don't feel like they're just having to buy the new house land package in Mernda or in Tarneit, that there actually are other options in other locations to create that infill.
The only other comment I'd make is that I think we've all been quite shocked about the growth in Greenfields housing markets that has happened since COVID, and that's obviously something that we're monitoring, and we are looking at, and we have historically supported Plan Melbourne's aspiration for 70% of development to occur in established areas, and will continue to do so.
And the other thing I'll add is that, as shown on those maps, there's already a lot of gaps. People are already living in these areas. People are raising their families in growth areas that have have occurred in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Kids that have grown up and not had access to some of this infrastructure, and by better planning now, we can minimise that impact, but also improve the lives of everyone that is already living and going to move regardless into these growth areas. So it's important to acknowledge that as Jody mentioned earlier in the presentation, everyone deserves good access to social infrastructure, regardless of whether you live in Tarneit or in Brunswick. Everyone deserves that access.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a few questions along this theme. Has any thought or modelling been done on the operational costs? There's questions from Beth Lapino. She suggested that the ongoing costs are often what prohibit councils committing to these new facilities, and can or should the state government commit to increased operational funding?
Yeah, it's a good question, Beth. We are Infrastructure Victoria, so we tend to stick to the infrastructure story. I know that's a little bit of a easy out for us, but it is our remit to look at infrastructure. Obviously, when we've said do the planning, and that's including the planning and feasibility, at that point in time, I would expect councils would be looking at not just the feasibility of building, but also operating. So yeah, we don't, it's not really part of our remit, but I understand that it's a challenge.
Okay, I think this question's probably along similar lines, Jody, but you might be able to clarify this for us. Would you see this as an ongoing funding stream or one-off funding for the next facility in the pipeline?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Look, at the moment, we're trying to do this step change. We're trying to say state government step in and do more. So we've made it sort of achievable and say, let's get the planning done now for the next 5 years. Let's start to see if we can deliver more of these hubs and do the integrated work and get them working better and in a more timely way. I think what we do is we monitor this work, and two things could happen. Either this could prove to be a really important step change, and new partnerships and ways of delivering for growth areas could continue, or we could get to our next strategy and look at it again, and who knows, we might in 5 years' time saying, hey, look, the bigger problem is now in regional Victoria, or the bigger problem is in the disadvantaged areas of Melbourne or whatever. So let's just get a step change going for now, and then we'll be able to monitor again for our next strategy.
Fantastic. I think we've got time to squeeze in one last question. And I'm sorry if we haven't got to all of the questions. I think we've tried to cover off most of the themes. But this last question is from Martin Chin. Is there an ideal ratio of persons to facilities? In your chart, you showed relative comparisons between council areas, but is there an ideal benchmark from your perspective?
Yeah, we could have a whole benchmarks discussion now, which we won't. But I think the best, I think the average provision rate is a good place to start, and I think then individual councils have got their own service models that they prioritise. I think it's dangerous to just look at an average provision rate. That's why we've included accessibility as well, because the provision rate on its own doesn't tell you enough. I think accessibility layer tells you more. And then the other layer is of the existing infrastructure that you may have. Is it working optimally? Is it going, you're sweating the existing asset as well as you can? So it's always going to be more complicated than a benchmark, but I think the comparative provision rate for metropolitan Melbourne is a start, because at least councils can look at each other and say, well, we're a similar sort of council, you're delivering at a higher rate than us. Is that a model that we want, or are we delivering different infrastructure and different models? So it has to become back to what the service priorities are of local governments.
And there's also different types of libraries and also different types of aquatic centres as well. So this is just the what's been presented today are some averages, but not all of the same. So that's why you need to do the planning and really work out, where can you share facilities between two municipalities? There's a whole range of other aspects. So we've very much provided a very high level, but each location is got its own unique needs and so forth. So this is really about shining a light on it, showing that we need, councils need support in planning, and it needs to be coordinated across Melbourne to make sure we're getting the most out of this infrastructure.
Okay, Peter, I'll hand back to you. Okay,
well, thanks everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today and got a lot out of it. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to be on our website in a few days' time. So feel free to go on and watch this again or share it with some of your colleagues who might not have been able to attend. And please, by all means, if you've got any questions, get in touch with us, and don't forget to get in touch with us via LinkedIn and Twitter as well. So thanks again for everyone. Thank you, Jody and Giselle and Mandy, for your support today. Thank you everyone for dialing in. There's been a number of people showed a lot of interest in this topic, and I must admit, of the 94 recommendations in the strategy, I'm with Jody. This is my favourite one as well. I think it's fabulous, and since I joined IV, I learned a lot more about libraries and aquatic centres than I thought I ever would. So it's a really interesting topic, and we welcome your feedback on this as well. So thanks again.